It's another Saturday morning, and that means another not playing politics with Alexander Keaton and Nick Bradshaw. Today's wonderful guest is Lee Tuttle. Lee, how you doing today?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
No, it's a pleasure to have you on. Today we're going to be talking about the politics of the virus that shall not be named, considering how YouTube and Google and Facebook seem to treat the virus. But again, none of us here are doctors per se, so I really think we should focus more on the political fallout of it and then the ramifications of it. Nick, why don't you kick us off? What are your thoughts? Where do you want to start on this? Because this is such a multifaceted topic.
Yeah, good morning, and welcome to our teammate Lee. Glad to have you aboard. I think what's fascinating about this, and the reason that we're bringing the show to this topic now, where COVID, we're talking months and months in. We're not trying to pick up some secret topic here. I think what we're doing is we wanted to give it enough time to see how things would play out so that we could address it. Obviously, subject matter has been highly politicized, like virtually everything else through this lens. And what's interesting, at least for me, is the manner with which we spoke previously about cancel culture, and the manner with which it seems like we're using some of the same tactics when it comes to putting out information. For example, there are several groups of clinicians that have come together, dozens, if not hundreds, that have signed records stating officially that they believe schools can be safely opened. But the battle lines that are being drawn is saying, if you, once again, if then, it's a conditional. If you believe schools should be open, you want to endanger children. And I just don't think anything is that binary. I think that we're trying to look at other things like what are secondary and tertiary effects to what COVID is doing. We're seeing increased alcoholism, increased spousal abuse, increased infidelity, increased divorce rates or familial struggles, we'll call it. So these
Suicides are up,
suicidality and that, of course. So there is another side to this coin, and so I think that the conversation we wanted to have this morning was, why are we politicizing them? What are specific elements that we're looking at? And so for me, to get us kicked off here this morning, I thought the one that stands out with a background in teaching that spoke to me was the politicalization of bringing children and college-age students back to school. So that's the subject that I think that drawn attention to me, and I don't see how that's something that can be politicized. It needs to be discussed, understood, and addressed. So to get your feet wet, kicking it right off the bat, we're going to kick it over to Lee and see what she's thinking.
So it's an interesting viewpoint to think about for me. I grew up with an educator for a father. Mom worked at the same school. However, grew up out in the middle of the country in rural Michigan. So 1,700 people. My graduating class was 98 people. So for that community, what they're looking at right now, they're going, hey, we haven't even seen the virus here. Why are we so scared of everything? Why are we considering not opening our schools or, trying to force parents to teach their students from home when they're, trying to get back to work? So it's an interesting question when you look at, bigger picture, other scenery than where we're, currently at. Whereas here in Texas, I'm slightly terrified. Every time I leave my house, other than a hike or paddleboarding, I'm wearing my mask because we're a hot spot. So I guess that it kind of makes me question both sides of, I don't think there's an end all be all answer for this, because I think in smaller rural communities, out in the middle of Colorado or Wyoming, they probably are completely safe going back. Whereas bigger communities, especially hot spots, it's a much more multifaceted approach that they're going to have to take to it. And it's going to be based on, like you said, a number of things, the familial structure, fear, medical side of things, underlying conditions that people had. I'm worried about the teachers, the support staff who are various ages. They're not young people. They're not necessarily 100% likely to fight everything off. As well, we don't know long-term effects from people who do survive it. I mean, we're hearing more and more about heart conditions, heart ailments that are going to hang on for the long run. So I don't know. I want to look at the bigger picture. I don't think you're going to make everybody happy. There's no one size fits all answer for this, just a lot more questions. And I really hope that we get people involved who are working in school systems, who are educators, who are, principals, et cetera, not just people who are in business who are worried about getting their employees back to work.
Lee said two very important things there that I'd like to play off of for just a second. The first, she is clearly not from Texas. I love the fact that they were hat spats. Okay, but seriously, did you grow up eating poutine? Because I had never heard of that until
poutine's Canada. We didn't have that in Michigan.
Yeah, I did. Well, I thought it was a Canadian thing, but I've got friends from Michigan, and they're like, "Oh yeah, we ate it all the time," and I'm like, I'd never even heard of it until like a year ago.
I actually had it in South Carolina for the first time, ironically.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I kind of looked at it like, really, it's just chili cheese fries, just a different version of it, I guess.
With cheese curds.
Yeah, it's with cheese curds. Yeah.
Delicious. I digress.
In the highly politicized world that we're in, do you think that if you tried to order it, you'd have to order Vladimir Putin's?
And
the dad jokes start.
Exactly.
Oh, wow. And we just lost 9 of our 11 listeners.
Yeah, exactly. So, but seriously, one of the things that you mentioned, and I think it really kind of even strikes at the core of what the channel is for, right? You said there isn't a one size fits all sort of answer to this thing. The answer is way more nuanced, and we need to have a much broader conversation than what we're having. The reason this channel is called Not Playing Politics is that the basic fundamental thesis that I have is the reason our world is as screwed up as it is, particularly here in the US, is that we, for the last, I mean, you could, I don't know that you necessarily put a pin on any one date, but for a very, very long time, we've been playing politics. We've allowed politics to be, 2,000 years ago was bread and circuses. Well, somehow we managed to make the bread and circuses our political structure. So that's why things never really seem to get solved. The fight remains so that there's a fight. And it doesn't actually benefit us as a people. And I think the problem that we're seeing with the whole COVID thing is the fact, I'm sorry, I just said it, with the virus that shall not be named, is that, we're not actually dealing or treating it with the nuance that's required, right? This is a disease. This isn't some theoretical, philosophical model that we're discussing. These are all questions of practicality and fact. So but we're unwilling to have this nuanced conversations. Like, well, what do the facts actually show? What do we know for certain? What's most probable? And what are we and work at it that way. And I think that's our problem, right? We're trying to have this sort of absolute black and white conversation where there's no room for that. It's about, we need to have a more nuanced and gradated conversation so we can figure out what's the best way to move forward. And the thing is, a lot of the information that we saw very early on has borne out, right? As far as its actual lethality, because originally they were saying, oh, this could be a 4 or even 8% lethality rate. But if you really paid attention to some of the early things with the cruise ships, right, you saw it was not nearly as communicable as some people were claiming. It was not as deadly as some people were claiming. And you could also see who the really vulnerable populations were and who the non-vulnerable populations were. But instead of taking that information and saying, okay, we get this idea, at some point the politicians, the media ran with this other idea, and that's what just flooded the airwaves and has created panic. And panic never leads to wise decisions or well thought out plans. It just leads to the chaos that we've seen. It's like once everything started shutting down, it became a stampede. And the problem with that is, how do you solve the problem of a stampede without everyone running over a cliff?
Well, I think to your point, Alex, first off, I every time we've mentioned the bread and circuses from ancient Rome, I find it entertaining because I realize that in Central Texas, I would be more likely to find, poutine and kombucha. But I think that what we see now is the fact that I like what Lee said with regard to something I don't know that I've given as much thought to, and that is the geography of this. There are areas that are out there. Lee, you raised the point about being heavily concerned about living in Texas and having this there, and I think that this kind of speaks to our point today, where I think there's a bit of a fear-driven narrative. Look, factually speaking, this is a frightening and concerning thing. None of us have ever experienced it, at least in our lifetimes. Our grandparents, had they been alive in 1917, their great-grandparents may have addressed this and dealt with it at that time, but we haven't seen that in our lives. So there's a natural fear factor that we have to encounter, and I think it's normal and healthy that we address it that way. What I think is the most counterproductive to that, though, is when we see statistics that are just wrong. I mean, there's an old saying, there are lies, damn lies, and statistics. And I think that the concern that I see are these stories coming out now where you see these numbers that are just being wildly inaccurately released. And that breeds, now someone may say, oh, well, what's the difference of 500 or 1,000? Well, ask those 500 or 1,000 families. I think that there's a substantial difference there. I think where we start to get into an area where this topic becomes very, very hard to deal with is when we dive into data and without sounding cold, we see, I'm doing air quotes here, the cold, hard facts of what numbers we're actually dealing with. For example, Texas thus far, as of the last checking that I made, Texas has had 7,265 deaths, which is just utterly tragic. 7,200 Texans that lost their lives, 7,265. And that is a tragic state for any of us to be dealing with. You mentioned your small town in Michigan, and I love that there are places that this hasn't touched, and knock wood that it never does. Again, going to the numbers, and I'm presenting this only from a factual-based perspective, Texas has approximately 29 million people in its population. That means that the number of deaths to ratio of the number of people in the state, that's a death rate of 0.025%. That means that 99.975% of people are fine. I'm not trying to mitigate these losses, but I'm trying to mitigate the fear that it generates, because for our listeners of the show, Lee is a newer friend of the show, and it's hard for us to hear. Certainly for me, I won't speak for Alex, but it's harder to hear when we have friends that feel that level of fear. I have friends that are coming up on retirements in their jobs, and transfers of their jobs, and they can't have going away parties or celebrate with their friends, or friends that have gotten job promotions, or family members that you want to go see. You can't take some of these risks. So this is impacting our lives, and these fears are well grounded to be safe and take care of one another, of course, but we need to recalibrate it such that for listeners of our show, and certainly me hearing you say that, you and I have had many conversations, Lee, with regard to your concern about this and the proactive stance that you've taken to ensure your safety. But when you hear that 99.975% of people are not dying from this, does that bend the pendulum? Does that lean into the wind a little and maybe get that pendulum to swing back a little more towards center?
I mean, yes and no. And taking it from solely from the data standpoint, I've worked a number of jobs where I've dealt with data, and the great thing about it is you can make it say whatever you want. So I can then turn it around on the flip side, right, and say, okay, well, you're looking at the overall population. If we were just to look at those infected, or if we were just to look at, say, the 3 larger cities in Texas, one of which we, are living in, now what are my odds? So it's one of those where I guess I can no longer take it at face value. I want to know more, and if knowledge is power, then data is power as well, sort of. So yeah, it helps a little bit, but it's a virus, so there's a great unknown. I don't know when I get on a plane to head back to Michigan if the girl sitting next to me has been out at these parties and concerts and is a carrier, and I don't want to then pass it on to my 86-year-old grandma. So I'm steering clear from her. I'm not hugging anyone. So yeah, it's helpful, but I guess I always take it with a grain of salt, because I can make the data say what I want. You can make it say what you want, and I think I've seen so much of that back and forth with people of why I don't need to wear a mask, because this really low percentage, 0.025 death rate. Okay, why do I need to wear one? So it's not an end all be all for me. It's not the, okay, because of this, I'm completely safe, no worries anymore. Does it help a little bit? And maybe should it change the narrative slightly, like with the media? Possibly. I mean, when we look at the media, it's every day is doom and gloom. Every day is, death, and every topic is breaking news relative to this virus. And so maybe do we need to look at the data, and maybe do they need to change their messaging to help things? Possibly.
Well, and I think that's what you said there is really, really crucial. I mean, the fact that data can be manipulated in any number of ways. Little known fact: statistical analysis was the math I took for college because I ain't doing algebra again. But it is one of those things where it is you can see how things can be manipulated, and this goes back to the need for a more nuanced conversation about this, from dealing with issues of practicality, right, instead of fear, which is really the driving point. Mm-hmm. I think here is that our media is having this very fear-based provocative conversation because they don't, I don't know, this, I try not to ever assign malice when ignorance or greed can fills the void. But it is very clear that they're driving that this push for this very fear-based approach to the situation is what's causing a lot of this. Instead of saying, hey, there are precautions that can be taken that are simple and subtle, and it works. And it doesn't help the CDC can't seem to figure out what the hell is going on either, right? Like, it's like, oh, no, masks won't help you at all. And everyone in the world's looking at them like, what do you mean masks won't help? Okay, well, we'll buy it. You're the CDC, masks won't help. Now everyone's got to wear masks. It's like, well, okay, well, which one is it? It can't try, this thing is aerosolized and people are getting sick, on the other side of apartment buildings because it's going through the air system. But if you stay 6 feet apart, you're perfectly fine. It's like, there does seem to be this, everyone wants a silver bullet. It's like, well, if I do this, I won't get sick.
Yep.
Mentality. And it's like, the problem is, you're right. It is a virus. It's not going to happen that way. And the problem is, because we're not having a nuanced conversation, everything's about fear. It's about eliciting this response. I think that fear is creating bad choices, right? And it's leading us to make mistakes that don't need to happen. You're right. The big problem with this is that we don't know what was the unknown. This is a novel virus. There's a lot that we don't know. But as we look around the world, we can see places that haven't, shut down the way we have, and they in some cases are doing just as well. Well, what are they doing right? There are places that shut down and have done worse than we have. What did they do wrong? We can start looking at this and really start plotting things out. I think the thing that surprises me the most, well, okay, I'm a little too cynical to say I'm surprised. But this goes back to the whole idea of fear, right? Is that there have been a number of, and I know people are going to say, well, what, you're talking about that one crazy doctor from last week. It's like, well, it wasn't just her. She was with a ton of other doctors who were talking about this hydroxychloroquine thing. People have been talking about this for a while, saying, hey, I think the problem is it's presented as, well, here's the silver bullet that solves all of our problems. Well, I'm kind of a realist. I grew up a mechanic. There is no one thing that solves all problems, but may it be really a very effective treatment that may actually alleviate a lot of the issues that we're seeing, because we don't really have an effect, like unlike the common flu or colds that we have every year, which do kill quite a few people every year. There's something we have to mitigate for those people who have risks, right? With those, we have vaccines, we have other medicines that have proven over time to be effective towards relieving those particular things. So we can take, you can take your chance. This, we haven't really had it, but if this hydroxychloroquine Z-Pak zinc combo does, there are many people who are saying that's effective, and only one group who had, even the AMA came out and said that study that said that it wasn't effective They're like, y'all got some problems with the study, and it was actually pulled back. What I find interesting isn't the idea that maybe it's the silver bullet or anything like that, but it's the fact that people are completely uninterested in it. It's like well, we have this one unknown, untested drug that we think is going to be great, so we're just going to throw it out there. But then we have this other stuff that is known for 50 years. I've known a dozen different people who've had to take it for malaria or for lupus. It's cheap. It's easily accessible. It's easily manufactured because it's off-brand. Why is there not a broader conversation about that? Why is it every time someone says it, it's immediately shot down? And to me, I think it speaks to the politicization of this. And the only conclusion I come to is the reason it's shut down and come out the way it is, right? It isn't like, well, here's all of these studies that show it won't do anything. There's plenty of evidence to show that it might, at least might. Then why is it shut down? And the only thing I can come to is it's about money. No one's going to make money off of this, whereas some people are going to make a ton of cash off of these new drugs and new vaccines. And so, to me, it speaks back to the political nature of this conversation that we're having. Is that instead of having a nuanced, practical conversation about what's going to benefit the most people and what can we learn from new data as it comes in, it's everything you know and love is going to die if you don't wear your mask at Walmart, right? It's like those are two very different conversations, and they have two very different, I think, directions. One is saying, well, how do we solve this problem? The other one is, how do we metastasize this problem into something bigger, into something that seems very much like a power grab to me.
Well, the question that was asked was, or presented earlier was, the media's role and the representation, and why would the media present it in a fear-based way? And it's because it's in their best interest to do so, because by making that environment such that people feel fear, the way that you resolve that fear is by tuning into their channel and watching the information that they have to give you. The second tier effect of that is, but you got to make sure that the information they're giving you is accurate. The problem with that is that after a certain amount of time, people will normalize almost anything. They'll adapt and they'll adjust, and therefore some people disengage. The counterpoint that's being presented is, why is there no consistency? For example, there seems to be no shortage in the police being ordered to shut down businesses, or governments using local powers to ensure that, churches aren't meeting. But there doesn't seem to be pushback when people go to massive rallies. So the concern that is risen from that situation is not only the subject matter with which the rally may stand, or that the churches, are coming together for spiritual growth, or whatever the reason, or the driving primer behind why that organization is together, but inconsistency with which it's measured and it seems to be acted upon. And I think that as much as all of us support the First Amendment, of course, if we're going to create a fairness and an equality under law, and the rule of law's application in a society, especially under conditions like this, we have to look at how we equally and fairly distribute the powers of local government with regard to the implementation of law. So again, the point becomes, I had to attend a funeral this past week, and we were wildly separated in a church that holds 2,000 people, and there was an environment that you could see that fortunately the event was even able to take place, where others are not being able to even take place. And yet, if there's other rallies, you don't see the counterpoint to that, because I think that's the political side. That's where it's about driving a narrative. Where the media aids in that is not what they tell you to think, but what they tell you to think about. And they frame the stories. Again, I've used this example before, I'll use it again. All of us remember when, Russiagate was the biggest story in the world until it wasn't. And then it was Stormy Daniels or Michael Avenatti or Brett Kavanaugh or whatever. I mean, enter generic headline here. And now, for the past couple of months, obviously it's been COVID. Lee, before the show, you mentioned a great question, and I want to bring it up to our listeners really quickly. I mean, you guys remember out there in the internet world, do you remember when Brexit was the story of the year? It was the story of multiple years. It was the story of several elections in England and in the UK and what was going on. And then it was like, meh. So even on global level political impacts, we're seeing that. So again, I bring it back all the way. What is the purpose? What is the intent? And at the end of the day, it serves their interest to be able to, fear is a very easy fire to stoke. It's a very easy thing to generate in people, and they become dependent on that. They become dependent. We as people, I think, become dependent on the resolution of that fear, is what I mean. And we'll seek manners to do it. We'll buy more locks, we'll buy more guns, we'll go to less scary places, we'll do what we need to do, we'll buy more insurance, whatever it is. And I think that that's what we're seeing now. So my concern again becomes, if we have data that we can review, to your other point, Lee, about, you can make statistics say anything. I firmly agree. But there also are some, I don't see it necessarily as the same type of manipulation, if you will, between a political party utilizing a platform of COVID vice, doing basic levels of arithmetic to look at, okay, there are two, in our county, to make it smaller than the state of Texas, there are 274 deaths out of a population of 1.29 million. That comes down to the same ratio that's 0.021. So again, we're seeing these numbers kind of hold at certain points. It's going to be bigger in some places and smaller in others, to use your hometown as a hopeful model.
Right.
So again, I think the concern that's out there is, why would the media do this? I'm not trying to be the same person beating the drum that the media is the worst thing ever, but I do believe the media has a responsibility. And I think that the media responsibility should be to inform the public with accurate information. But since they are funded and are corporate entities, their funding, their underlying tone is to make money and to be supported so that they can continue in their operations. And that, I think, presents a cause for concern.
That's something that bothers me. I'm a journalism major, but I've not really ever used that major when it comes to news sources or such. But realizing how much it's money, it's a business, it's who owns it and what's their viewpoint. What can you say? What do we want to promote? And that's a hard pill for me to swallow. But I guess I want to ask you guys, though, relative to the media, relative to looking at this virus and having it be so politicized. If it's not an election year, what does this all look like? I mean, does that really play into it? Had this been, if this were to start in December of this year, or if this had been 2 years ago, does the media focus on it as much? Do the politicians, deflect various things as much? Or do you think it really has been made so much worse because it's an election year and we have such divisiveness in our country?
I'll take that one. At least I'll start off with it. Yeah, I think it's absolutely because it's an election year. I think if this had been a non-election year, or if it had been a Democrat president, or maybe even just someone other than Trump, they would have the media wouldn't have spun it the way they did. Because if we look at very, very early on during this whole process, right, there were a lot of people who were saying, "Hey, this thing that's going over here in China, this is a problem. We need to look into this a little bit more." And Dr. Fauci, the CDC, and the media, they all came out and said, "Oh, don't worry about what's going on in China. It's just, what we really should be caring about is this flu, because this is a really bad flu season." Again, I'm not a doctor, so I'm not going to speak as to what's what here. But the simple fact of the matter is, it's like they were, at the end of the day, this is basically, it is novel in the fact that you can become contagious before you feel symptoms. And so it is something to care about because it allows you to spread it more. Again, on average, you get sick first, or you have symptoms, so to stay in bed, or to stay home to mitigate your contagious nature, right? With most other diseases. So we have ways of mitigating it. So a lot of people saw that this was going on, and they said, "Hey, this is a thing," but it was completely shut down. I think if this had not been an election year, I think if the media thought this wasn't something they could kind of do a gotcha on Trump on, I think this would have just been treated as, hey, there's a new strain. They would have even addressed it this way: there's a new strain of flu coming out of China, and it has some weird things. So we're looking into it. Looks a little interesting. Let's all take some vitamin C, and let's maybe think about wearing some masks and washing your hands more often. And that would have been the end of it, right? I think it never would have been hyped this much. I think at some point it is very much tied into the fact that this is an election year, and they thought it's just one more thing they could go after the president for. I think that is the absolutely driving factor here.
So I'm going to follow up. First off, it's an outstanding question, and it warrants a lot more time for us to think about than we're going to do on a live show right here in this moment. It's a very, very important and I think multifaceted question. I think for a lot of people out there, and I want to word this delicately, no one, of course, would ever want anything like coronavirus to enter their community or their country or their population. However, I think that in speaking to some people, the manner with which coronavirus has absorbed the news cycle completely has probably shielded a lot of us. In fact, I think, Lee, you and I have spoken about almost escaping what would have likely been the most politically driven election cycle in the history of the world. That would have just gone on and on and on brutally to a level that would be unmatched. So it's almost like we're being shielded from that, because the level of politics in 2016 with regard to the election with Trump and Hillary Clinton, I think, was much more in the foreground than this has been. I think that we entered again into the politicalization of this from substantial ways, meaning actions that were taken by the government, and then very inconsequential ways that are the highly political score points. The example I'm thinking of is the simple naming of the virus. Many viruses, as our listeners know, are named based off of the region of the world that they come from, or what it is that they are. MERS is Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, or Ebola from the Ebola River, or places that it's come from, right? The Spanish flu. But because of the identity politics driven environment that is so wildly supported by the media, there was an article I saw. A guy said, how are we ever going to defeat the thing if we can't even come up with if we're spending more time fighting what we're naming it? And I think that draws almost to a silly level, because it's not some type of xenophobia to refer to something by its origin, as we have all these other things. I think what it also exposed on a substantial level was the dependency that the world has with regard to its national defense, with regard to its pharmaceuticals, and with regard to its economics, and specifically its manufacturing, on China. And that as much as the globalist market and globalist perspective of that market is viewed as efficient and being able to utilize all these things, you're also seeing what happens when the wind blows the other direction. So for me personally, I think that had this not been an election year, it still would have been very much in the foreground. Maybe not to the same level. I agree with Alex, not to the same level, but it gives a minority party a voice of something to complain about, because again, their objective is power. And so any minority party wants more power. They're the minority. They don't have it. So they want more power. So by expressing whatever it's the old concept. No matter what it is that you do, I can do better. In current polling, they stated that more people had faith that Joe Biden could have handled the coronavirus better than President Trump. Well, he's had no engagement with it. So how do you know that? When it comes to the economy, people overwhelmingly support and believe Trump can rebuild it. So the question is what are voters going to pull the lever on the fear of a virus or on their wallet? And I think that if this is not an election year, there's just not as much for them to be talking. I mean, this is the hot button issue, right? This is going to come down to whether or not they want to use vote by mail, if they want to use, and how that's going to be implemented. There are those out there that say this was the power grab that many on the left were looking for. Now they can articulate all their dreams that they want. There are those on the right that I think look at this as, we're just funding the economy in oblivion, and we're going to, our great grandchildren are going to be living on a charitable grant from the Chinese Communist Party. So I don't think you win looking in either direction. I think what is so critical right now is what we tried to start just by this simple show, which is having conversations and having people get out there and talk. This is where doing politics, as Alex talks about, is so important, that we come together, unify, and create a solution. I think both sides have methods and manners that we could be substantially more empowered by executing policies. Unfortunately, what we're seeing in the media, and I think that you, Lee, could probably address this from your perspective, I'd be interested to hear as well. And that is, this has definitely become a, whether you want to call it conservative, liberal, right, left, whatever, perspective. As crazy as it sounds, there are sides to this. There are those who blame the Trump administration. There are those who believe that China should be held accountable. And the split that I find interesting in this is that for many people who seem to want to blame the Trump administration, many of them, I believe, are the same people that also believe overwhelmingly in polling that China should be held accountable with regard to lawsuits from American citizens. So there's a waning posture as to who's truly accountable. Now, I think that looking back, coulda, shoulda, woulda, of course. But again, outside of an election year, is it there? Absolutely. Absolutely. But I don't know that it would be the rallying cry. I think, quite honestly, the defunding of the police, the Black Lives Matter movement, and other policies with regard to national security, international diplomacy, those are going to be your political topics that I think are a little more, because this is a global impact. This is not just the American situation right now. This is the whole world. So that's why I think it supersedes and transcends beyond our immediate election.
Well, okay, so I do want to get back to Lee here, but I do want to point one thing out, because I see what you're saying, that it shouldn't just be about politics, and I think Lee and I would agree with that. That this is a practical thing. This is about people's real people's lives here. This is not about politics, but I think it absolutely would have been handled different had this not been a political season. And I point actually to what you just referenced, the swine flu, right? You go back just a few years, we had the swine flu outbreak that killed a lot of people. And there wasn't this level of chaos over it. We didn't have a vaccine for that particular strain of flu that year. That was why there was sort of this, why so many people passed. Is that we weren't able to get the vaccines out, and so the people who were most vulnerable fell to it. But there wasn't this level of panic and chaos and fear. It was presented in a very logical and a very practical way. It's like, hey, this is a virus. This is how we deal with these things. This is the process. And it goes back to, again, just the fact that this is about playing politics versus doing politics. Politics is supposed to be the tool. Let me rephrase it. It's supposed to be the tool that we use to build a better society. And instead, we seem to have turned it into a game people play with us, the people, so that they can get power, and that our lives, our roads, our grandmothers and grandfathers, none of that, our children, none of it actually matters to them. We're fodder in a lot of this conversation when real lives are on the line here. People who spent their entire lives building something, their businesses are utterly destroyed. Their finances are utterly destroyed. Their dreams are destroyed. There are children who are missing school. And again, let's be honest, the kids who are missing school, it's not the wealthy children who are going to fail or are going to have that it's going to really adversely affect, right? Because a lot of them have tutors. They've been able to do the online thing. It's the lower economically status children, the families that are coming in, out of rural and poor communities, that are going to be the most adversely affected by the fact they've lost almost an entire year of school. So these are real things with real consequences and real people who suffer. But the more the media and the government and the people in the government are playing these games and trying to just make us afraid of everything instead of really trying to figure out how to solve this in a practical way, the more real people are hurt. And I think that's the real crime to this, is that I'd rather do the hard work of solving a problem than allowing some problem to metastasize over 20, 30, 40 years. Right. And to your point, I heard about Nick, about us borrowing against our great grandchildren's money. I heard a comedian the other day. He basically had the punchline. There was no punchline to this. He said, "Oh, we're not borrowing against our children's or grandchildren or even great grandchildren. We're borrowing against the entire concept of what money is." At this point, we've proven that we've destroyed the entire concept of money, and there's nowhere for this to go except to end very, very badly, economically speaking, for everyone. So I think there's a lot of facets to how we've played this game, because the consequences are real. This is going to hurt real people. And I think the fact, so yeah, that's just kind of
So
No, go for it.
I'm interested to hear Lee's perspective on this. And Lee, not to put you in the position of having to provide, the strategic, policy here, but I
But
am.
we will.
What do you listen up, world? Here comes Lee. What do you see as a solution, a mitigating factor, a unifying force? What do you, I mean? Let's ask.
Wow,
throw
the big ones at me to solve. Jeez.
Yeah.
How do we solve this and unify and sing kumbaya and have a unified country and then world in which peace and prosperity reign?
Okay.
Go, Lee.
Yeah, give me 10 minutes. I got this. So
30 seconds. World peace.
30 seconds? Golly. Okay. So I think the big thing kind of that Alex has pointed out is we're really more about who's to blame here, right? Like point the finger, and then whether we go after them and we say, okay, we can sue you, or we're going to pull out, troops, we're no longer going to protect you. It's all about the blame game. And it's in politics, it's in media, it's in, looking at the overall money associated with it. But who's gonna unify? Whether it's, a president, somebody who can, get different sides talking, whether you're looking just at our political side of things, you say, okay, the Dems and the Republicans crossing the aisle, who's in the middle? But yeah, who's our unifier? Who's bringing us together? How do we get in the media side of things, the old school, gentlemen who were, Dan Rather comes to mind just because I remember him from my childhood, but he made me feel like there were positives in the world, that we could overcome things. And it's doom and gloom now. It's the money talks, and I want to hear somebody talk about how we set aside our differences, how we go, okay, yes, this virus has killed this many people. However, we do have some therapies that might be beneficial. We're working towards, a vaccine, which, let's be honest, when that vaccine comes out, everybody's not getting it. I don't know if I would right away, because it's unknown. But yeah, I want to know who's gonna unify us. Conversations like this that the three of us and 11 or 12 listeners, might be having, like, that's a starting point. When we say that our government is for us, the government is the people. So ergo, we have to take ownership of it as well, right? And start having these conversations and realizing that the three of us probably don't see eye to eye on everything. We probably have different ideals on a number of subjects, but hey, I'm willing to listen to you guys. Maybe we can make some, impression locally on some people. So that's not the policy to make the change, but like, that's my starting point is, for one, get people to talk, worry about more than just the money and, who's involved, who's making the most of it, because like you said, real lives are impacted. How many businesses have shut down and they aren't going to come back? And those are, the little mom and pops. Those aren't the ones making millions and billions of dollars a year, but those are the ones who control everything. So that's my 10-second, 30-second that rambled on for a couple minutes here. But how do we get people together, get them talking, stop pointing fingers, stop being so angry, right? Stop having everything be black and white. Find the gray area. Let's live in that. Let's focus on that and see how we come back together.
Well, I think that's a good point, and I like that. The point in particular, we had a previous show about cancel culture, and one of the things that we were discussing, I think we're seeing in play right now, which is what I hear from what you're saying is we have to be able to make sacrifices to come together to unify. And what's interesting is that it seems as though through cancel culture, and forgive the play on words, but we've sacrificed the ability to sacrifice. And by that, I mean, sometimes when we listen, I like what you said, hey, I'm here to listen. And to contribute your ideas. And I hope you know that we're here to listen to you as well. I think that listening is something that has been sacrificed for fear of discomfort, for fear of not reinforcing what someone wants to feel, because that external validation has to come from somewhere. And if you start challenging that, then I feel uncomfortable. I believe it was Skinner who said, those who can't control what they feel have to control how others behave. And I think that we're seeing some of that, both politically and socially. I think to the point that you made about money, I think that's very, very telling. And I also like what Alex said with regard to this conceptualization of what is money, in fact. And here's an example of something that is the clearest for me, who is by anything not an economics major. But it's fascinating to see. We have 20 million plus people that are unemployed, businesses, as you said, that are gone for forever. And yet big tech and other corporations in the stock market are out of, to look at the stock market, you wouldn't know it. You wouldn't know it at all. Now, for full disclosure, I am invested in the stock market, and there are things that I try to manage, and very modestly, I'm in comparison to a great many people, but it's something that there's a disconnect. You've got 20 million people unemployed, business has gone forever, no real deadline as to when we're going to like spool everything back up and turn all the switches of the economy back on, but they're kind of going. And running away. And I saw an article, it was worded interestingly. And what they said, if you want to really consider what a redistribution of wealth is, what has happened is that the American economy for its inception has been powered by small business. And now we're seeing that shift not go from rich to poor or socialist perspectives or capitalist perspectives, but we're watching it go to big corporations. Now, my inner 90s kid is going to put on my Doc Martens and my flannel shirt. I'm going to get my Nirvana record going. And I'm gonna rage against this, corporatization of everything. But you look at these companies, and you would never know that there's something like that going on. Now, to solve it, we need to, as you said, Lee, come around a unifying factor. I don't know that there is necessarily a singular person for that. I think we need to come back to the ideals and the belief structures that we have held as a country for so long. You're right. It's like everybody is angry everywhere all the time. And it seems like that's because we've sacrificed the ability to make our own sacrifices and listen. We've got corporations that are now cashing hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of profits coming from industries that are now going to be drastically impacted. And we've got an environment out there that I don't know that people know how to identify culturally, socially, and academically with what their own country stands for. We spoke previously on the show about, what the riots are doing and tearing down statues. And, the thing is when you go and you start tearing down things like Mary or Frederick Douglass or World War II monuments, you have to start asking yourself, what are we fighting? Like, what's the direction? As the Latin says, quo vadis, where are we going? I don't know that we know that. So I agree with you wholeheartedly. We need to find a point. To me, that's not a person. It's a belief. It's a belief in the idea of what America is. It's a belief in what meaning taking care of one another means. And I know that that's what you're driving at as well. I absolutely I'm running on your coattails here, but that's what I wish that we could focus on. And yet when people are afraid, I think a lot of our choices are very desperate, and I think that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing desperation because it's just masked fear. And to Alex's point with regard to economics and money, yeah, I think we are. We're seeing a redesignation as to how to apply this and what it's doing. If you look at the local housing market, I've had a chance to work with some realtors recently, and they were saying like it's the hottest that they've seen the economy or the housing market here. And I thought, wait a minute, what? That makes no rational sense. Until you dig into the numbers and you see how truly sad it really is as to why it's so hot. And one of the reasons it's so hot is because so many people are losing their homes. So people are jumping in and buying things like crazy. And it's that trade-off. So I think that unification has to come from a belief in us sharing a value system again, and a belief in us unifying as a people, as a country, as a structure, and as an organization that believes in the identity of who we are. And I think that is the only way that we can get through this without coming out more bifurcated and separated and segregated into our own thoughts and our own beliefs.
Well, I think one other step we have to take, and I completely agree with everything you just stated, is that we've lost the ability to even understand that plans and decisions on matters of practicality are not issues of morality. What we've entered in is this age where everything is a moral question. It's not an issue of practicality. And either you get everything 100% right all the time and everything's roses and butterflies, or you're evil super Satan, right? And
just quickly for our listeners, is Super Satan basically Satan but wearing like a leather jacket on a motorcycle?
No. That would be Ghost Rider. Basically, he would Super Satan is Satan, but like from Krypton, right? So, yeah, he's like really really bad Satan. So like he has like 4 horns instead of 2. His tail is like serrated. It's really bad.
Okay.
Yeah. Which is why you need the Archangel Luther to take care of him. Anyway,
And we just lost our last 3.
It's a whole different church than I've been to.
Yeah, which is by the way, I like Lee's. Exactly, I like Lee's optimism that we had 9 listeners.
Exactly.
I'm like, wow, there's that optimism, that can-do spirit.
I sent it to my parents, guys. Come on, they better be on.
Wow.
No, we just lost them actually.
Hello to Lee's parents. Sharing her with us, and her wonderful values are coming out. We appreciate it. Thank you, Mom and Dad.
But yeah, no, this is, for me, I think this is one of the big problems I see, just not just about COVID, but everything. It's like certain groups have come out with this sort of almost doctrinal statement, right? It's a dogma, and it's like, these are the people that we listen to, and whatever they say is holy gospel, and if you deviate from these, it is because you're evil, and you're greedy, and you want people to die. And I'm like, that's not a you don't have a conversation that way. Imagine if we had a car broken down on the side of the road, we're in the middle of nowhere, we have to fix it, and you have a group of people. One of them's like, well, okay, well, let's just see what's actually wrong. And then if it's the radiator, we can patch it up doing this, if it's right. But the other group's like, no, we have to put a brand new engine in it right now, or you're all going to die. You can't move forward that way. It's like, no, this is a practical solution. It's a practical problem. Let's have practical solutions. Let's weigh and measure what we can do against what we can't do. And yet and instead of having that conversation, it's like we're having this other very, very emotionally driven conversation. And it seems like we've lost even the ability to have a rational conversation in which practical solutions can be derived from. And Lee, to your point, does that mean we need a unifying factor, or do we need to kind of, I hate using the term re-educate because of the connotations, but does there need to be someone who comes out here and is like, look, I'm not going to solve all your problems, but at least re-teach you how to think and separate what's emotion, what's theology, what's morality, and what's practicality?
That would be a good start. I mean, that's one of my biggest pet peeves, especially on social media, is how many people just repost something or they regurgitate it. And had we tried to pass that off on, a project in an English course back when we were in school, our teachers would have ripped it apart. They would have, first of all, gone, okay, this is not a valid source. This is, this is just some whack job on the internet. This is not a scientific journal. This has not been vetted at all. And at the same point, I mean, I went to a liberal arts college, and people will question that, and they'll ask, what kind of education I got. But my takeaway was that they taught us how to think, right? They brought in different people with different viewpoints, far left, far right, and they said, here's what they represent. Now let's talk about it, and let's think. And that helped me because I realized I didn't think 100% like my parents, right? And that was the first opportunity I had to go, okay, I disagree with you guys on, immigration or on financial side of things. But it was so helpful. And it just feels like social media now has just, I hate to use the term, but has dumbed everything down, and people aren't thinking as much anymore. It's just, it's fun. It's easy as well. They're hiding behind social media, right? Like,
yeah,
go call out your government, call out your neighbor, say the most awful things, but yeah, in person, they seem very kind-hearted and we have a great time. So yeah, I think re-education, or, just a first go around of, education for some folks, and teaching them, how to think, how to worry about, okay, their family, their beliefs, their morals, etc. And then also look big picture. I think that's something a lot of people are stuck in, is that they're very me-centric, right? They focus on themselves, their immediate family, or their immediate city or town or whatever. But big picture, what about the rest of the United States? What about your fellow Americans who you so strongly say you support as well? So yes, it's a start.
Can I say one thing real quick? And since we're wrapping this episode up, and this is slightly off topic, but I think it really strikes at the core of even what we're talking about is Nick over here is conservative. I'm conservative. I'm probably even more conservative than he is. And yet every time we have someone who's more liberal, we can't find anything to disagree on. We've had you, we've had Tim, we've had all these other people on here who are supposed to be more liberal, and we can't disagree on anything. It's like this goes back to the power of conversation, right? It is if we actually sit down and just have a conversation, everyone seems to sort of agree on the broad strokes of things. And maybe I think if we were to get down to the nitty gritty of how do we actually execute a few things, we would have some disagreements there. But it sounds like we could even maybe resolve those because we've learned how like you said, how to think, how to resolve problems, things like that. And I think this is, to me, it sort of underlines just how divisive our modern media and, like to your point, social media are. I have a long-standing, I don't believe in conspiracy theories because I just don't see any evidence that humans are smart enough to pull it off. But this right here is almost evidence that there must be some sort of conspiracy out there to keep people just because by focusing on all this negativity, by focusing on division, by focusing on fear, by having this attack on critical thinking and on issues of resolution. This almost feels like a deliberate attack on that to keep us divided, to prevent us from actually moving forward, and rather keeping us in this perpetual state of chaos and anger and fear in order for someone to benefit from this. Because it just, again, you, Tim, we all seem to agree on these broad strokes, and even on some of the smaller things. It's like, I thought there was supposed to be this huge divide, and yet it seems like we're walking almost hand in hand. We're just on either side of a very maybe broader line than we realize.
Well, I think to that point, excuse me. I think to that point, we are we're people, right? I mean, and
are we, Nick? Are we really?
I don't think that we necessarily have, we can look at where we align maybe politically or whatnot. We had a guest on last week. I want to give a quick shout out to our buddy Doug, who brought up a wonderful point on a piece that he had been working on. And he said, focus on the noun, meaning that if you look at Romance languages, Spanish and Italian and French, many times I'll use Spanish, for example, the adjectives follow the noun. So you have La Casa Amarilla, amarillo. So you've got the yellow house. Translated literally, it means the house yellow, the house that is yellow. But in English, we have, as a Germanic language, we have a adjective leading noun structure. The brand new red shiny sports car. The very last thing I did was tell you what it was. So I described the property of it, but not what it was. So I'm not pushing back on what you said, Alex. I mean, I would say that my friends that know me would say that I'm certainly, right of center, but I think we are all in our own world. I don't think we're to the left or right of anything. I think we're all seeking out what we view through our lens as the center, and we are people. So I think that the reason that we're getting along or having productive conversations, more importantly, is that we are all coming together with respect of the people that are with us, but also respect of the ideal and of the principles of what open dialogue is. And I think that's what we're asking. We're asking our leaders to lead. Leaders should lead. And if that's not what they're going to do, we, the people, read that somewhere, have the power of a vote to make those changes. And so I when I was speaking to Lee about trying to get her on the show, and Lee, welcome. We're so glad you're able to join us, and hi to your wonderful parents listening back in Michigan.
Oh, we've lost them, by the way.
Yeah, they shut it off a while ago.
we lost them at the Super Devil part. But what I'm saying is that I think it's belief in something that's bigger than just ourselves, and where we've come into a lot of these struggles, I think, is because the focus on the self has become so important. Because through, I'll use social media, through things like social media, there are so many ways that we can create metrics about ourselves and have people give us instant feedback, that external validation has become so much more prevalent, I would say almost insidious into our culture.
Yes, I would agree.
That I think it's dangerous. And what we do to come here, I said to Lou when I was trying to court her to come on the show, was this is where we want to go to have that cathartic process, to learn, to grow, to share ideas, to feel empowered, but to feel challenged and to not be afraid to be challenged. I don't know that we live in a time that we feel comfortable to say the words, I don't know, because like you said before, Alex, every hill is a hill to die on. Every hill has to be defended to the last man or woman. And it's like, all right, do we really need to get this politically charged about soup?
Yes.
Can we just
soup?
No soup for you.
No soup for you.
It's ramen noodles for 9 cents a bag. Like, just eat it and enjoy it and have 700 times the sodium you should have in a lifetime. But the point that I'm getting at is that what we cherish about this show, and Lee, why we're so grateful for you to be here, is to be able to take a platform, because we know that we're a lot of us are drawing from our friends and family in our lives that are having these conversations with us. So we always want to thank them for not just listening in, but they can probably hear a lot of their input on this show. And I think it's the sooner that we open ourselves back to listening, making that sacrifice, and coming to this platform to share those opinions openly, but also with respect for a difference of opinion, are we able to get us down the road a bit farther? And that's where I'm going to focus my attention, is that I say with the show each time, I love to have this platform. I'm here to listen, and I'm so grateful for those of you that participate.
All 12 of you. Now, Lee, thank you. Ms. Tuttle, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate you and your insights. We definitely want to have you back on, although you probably are like, nope, not coming back again. Not this
I just did
place.
this. I did this for the ice cream later, so.
Oh, okay. So
I can be bought.
For those of you who are West Wing fans, it's their love was for sale, and I wanted it. So yeah, no, absolutely. So again, thank you for coming on. Enjoy the ice cream later, and for everyone who is still listening, which appears to be not any of you, thank you, and we appreciate y'all hanging in for as long as you did. And we will see y'all in 2 weeks, and we'll have some more interesting and apparently non-confrontational conversation. We got to find something to disagree on, or we're never going to grow this channel.
Let's make a promise that next show all we do is fight like that. We're just gonna scream just obscenities at one another nonstop.
Next
Done.
week, Epstein.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Next episode, we'll talk about Epstein and why he absolutely certainly killed himself. All right, guys. We'll see y'all in 2 weeks. Be good.
Take
Thanks,
care.
guys.